Welcome to Health versus Wealth with Dr. Ben, where each week it's my great pleasure to meet fascinating people who tell us about the challenges they're facing with their work-life balance. I'm Dr. Ben Sinclair, and I wonder, do you struggle with your priorities? On the one hand, focusing on your work, business or career, namely your wealth, or on the other hand, looking after your health, which is so important. Over the past 20 years as a GP, I've seen many people spending too long on their screens, cutting corners on their sleep, diet or exercise. The result? Their work life's going well, but their health can suffer. I sincerely hope that my guests' personal and professional experiences may help you to improve your own health and life. Welcome. Now today, I'd like to start with asking you, the listener, a question. Do you feel you've ever been held back at work because of prejudice? Now maybe it's your ethnicity, gender, or because you suffer from a disability. But prejudice is a real issue for millions of people, and my guest today is CEO and business founder who's devoted his entire career to encouraging greater levels of equality, diversity and inclusion in the workplace. So Mac Alonge, great to meet you.
Good to meet you. Thanks to be here.
Thanks for coming in. Now, for 6 years, you've run your own consultancy, the E.D.I Group. Mm-hmm. Tell us, why did you name it that, and what work do you do?
I'm afraid to say there's no great story about how we named it. I guess we kind of took the Ron Seal approach, which is we wanted to embody what we do. So the E.D.I Group is a name, I think, that encompasses everything that we do, everything we aim to deliver for our clients and the individuals that work or participate with those organisations. So the E.D.I Group is essentially what we want to embody in society.
I love the Ron Seal analogy, so it does what it says on the tin.
Does what it says on the tin, yeah.
Fantastic. Now let's talk more about that in a bit, but I want to go back into the background behind this and you. You've got a distinguished academic background and you've had 10 years in the energy sector. What's your personal experience of working there?
So the energy sector was great in terms of it gave me an opportunity. I've always been really interested in economics and it allowed me to really lean into that side of things. But one thing that I noticed very early on, kind of day one, was just how much the sector lacked diversity, and not just from an ethnicity perspective, but from all kind of dynamics of diversity. And it's something that I felt at the time was just what the energy sector was like. But over time, I saw actually that there were a number of barriers that were put in place, or a number of, people often talk about the old boys club, and I didn't know how real it was until I was in the sector, and I was like, actually it is an old boys club. Like, you guys literally went to school with each other, literally went to university with each other, all of your kids are friends, and it's literally like a club. So when I kind of saw that and observed that up close, that kind of gave me kind of a desire to want to change things. But the sector was great in terms of it allowed me to really express myself. It gave me something to be passionate about. And I say that from the context of I didn't know the work existed, if that makes sense. So as a child growing up, there's only so many professions you have an insight into. So you know what a teacher is because everyone has a teacher, you know what a doctor is because everyone has a doctor, you know what a police officer is because people engage with police officers or you see them in movies or whatever. So there's only a limited number of professions. You've never really seen a film about an energy consultant or a regulatory consultant. It's like the boring side of energy that people don't really see. I say boring, it's boring, probably boring for quite a lot of people, but for me I found it really interesting.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? We don't get told these archetypes. We get the basics, the vocations.
Exactly.
There's so many other careers out there.
Oh, 100%. And I think the career visibility is one of the things that we work on. Career visibility is very limited, especially from the context of if your family only engage in a certain type of work, you'd never really get a sense of what the art of the possible is or what the spectrum of opportunities are out there.
Yeah, and I guess that sort of privilege that comes with having more connections 100%. Means you might have more exposure to more careers and know what's out there.
Yeah.
But if you've got less of that, you just have these limited ideas of what your teacher tells you is possible.
Absolutely that.
It's quite scary, isn't it? Mac, you mentioned family there. I know you had a situation in your family that's fed into your experience. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so I think I got to kind of 10 years in the energy sector and I was really reflecting on my time in the sector, and around kind of probably 5 years prior to that, my dad his career kind of came to an end and ended his employment in employment tribunal. So took his employer to tribunal for essential racial discrimination. And a lot of the things that he cited in that case were things that I had experienced. So, being held back for promotion, having trained people that come into the organisation and those people surpassing him. There are a lot of kind of the things that may seem circumstantial, but actually when you put them together and it's kind of a pattern over a number of years, then it becomes quite considerable. And so he ended up winning his case against his employer. And it's something that I was reflecting on, say that he's at least 35 years older than me. I have experienced the same things that he's experienced. So 35 years, nothing's really changed. Am I going to be in a situation where I then have kids and pass on that same legacy where it's like just something that happens? And I think often we hear these things like you have to work twice, 3 times, 4 times as hard as your peers, and we kind of just accept it. And actually, I think there has to come a time when things change. There has to come a time when you can put in the same effort as your peer and feel that you progress in the same way, regardless of your race, regardless of your disability, regardless of your gender.
Such a powerful story. And what's really highlighted for me there is the fact that, your dad's much older than you. And yet, this is still happening only 5 years into your career in the energy sector. So It's quite worrying to know that these things are still going on. And I guess that drove you to set up the Equal Group in 2018.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was, again, reflecting on kind of my work. And again, I loved my work, loved the sector, but did feel that I was held back in certain situations. As I said before, like the concept of the boys club, which I felt was theoretical, seeing the practical reality of that, I felt was quite worrying. And, to your point, if this is a trend that continues over 10, 20, 30, 50 years, what does that bode for the future of our children? So I was in a situation where I was relatively comfortable, had reached a stage where, my CV was great enough to be able to feel that I had a certain level of comfort. But I really reflected on the work I was doing on a day-to-day basis and felt that I wasn't adding much to society.
Sounds like you have a strong values-based drive to give back to society and contribute. So what sort of organisations do you engage with? How long does it take for you to make a difference in the Equal Group when you're working with an organisation?
Yeah, so in terms of the types of organisations we work with, we're completely sector agnostic, so we work across public, private and voluntary sectors.
Okay.
In terms of the size of organisations, we've worked with every kind of type of organisation from 20 employees to 35,000.
It's quite a range.
Yeah, a significant range. We tend to find a sweet spot between 500 and 1,000 because we feel like that's the stage at which you're starting to really look at your policies, really look at your procedures, really look at how you do things. Typically, organisations in that phase are growing into what the next phase of the organisation looks like. But in terms of how long it takes to really add value, we kind of add value from day one, depending on the situation that the organisation is in. But we try to work with organisations over the long term. So this is something that I gave an analogy a couple of months ago, that people need to view this like a weight loss journey or an exercise regime, where you can't just go to the gym once and pump weights or run on the treadmill and then the next day expect to see all of these muscles and a great cardiovascular system. It just doesn't work like that. You have to put in that commitment over the long term, and that's the ethos that we live by. So we like to have long-term partners.
Now you mentioned a sweet spot for the size of company. What's the sweet spot for the length of time that you would work with a company like that to demonstrate good results and increase performance in this area?
Yeah, so we tend to see kind of anything from 3 years plus. So 3 years we think is enough time for organisations to really get to grips with the scope of things that they need to do. Again, this isn't just about hiring, it's not just about policies, but it's about looking at everything that you do as an organisation, and unfortunately that takes time. The way that we work is to be data driven, and the reason for that is data gives us a good starting point for where you are as an organisation. We let the data drive us in terms of what we focus on, how significantly we focus on those, what we need to prioritise, etc. But it takes time for those data points to come back in terms of what's changed, what's working, what's not working, and therefore how does our approach need to evolve.
I love the fact that you're using data, because there's a sort of scientist, I'm really interested in seeing objective results. And I'm quite interested to know, you mentioned about the energy industry and there's still a sort of old boys network operating.
Yeah.
Do you have data that demonstrates that that's like in other sectors across the board? Is there still this UK culture of the old school tie operating everywhere?
There is. I guess we've got more data from the energy sector because that's where a lot of our clients are. So we do a cross-industry data collection piece, which demonstrated last year that 30% of the senior leaders in the sector come from private schools versus 7% of the population. So 7% of the population went to private school, 30% of leaders in the energy sector went to private school. So you can definitely see there's a massive disparity, and we really need to address why is that? Is it that we have this unconscious bias that when we view leaders that have been to private school, we esteem them more highly than people that haven't? But there's all kinds of things that we can dig into there to understand what the reason for that is.
Very interesting. I guess we're having a change of regime in the UK at the moment from Conservative to Labour, so we may see a change in those people who maybe used to have gone to private schools, maybe going through state schools in the future. So that might change your statistics in the future.
It might do. Definitely. And I think that there's definitely something to be said there around really reflecting on where we are and where we want to be. And I think actually changes in regime give us the opportunity to really reflect on where we are, how did we get here, and also what does the future look like.
Welcome back to Health versus Wealth with Dr. Ben. If you're joining us now, I'm here with Mac Alonge, CEO and founder of the Equal Group, devoted to encouraging greater levels of equality, diversity and inclusion in the workplace. Now, Mac, for 6 years, you've run your own consultancy, the Equal Group. How are we doing as a nation?
I think this is a really good question. And a lot of companies also ask the same question. There's a keenness to compare ourselves to benchmark. I think the thing we really need to realise is that actually everyone's doing pretty poor in this. And I think as a nation, if we compare ourselves to other nations, it can be quite disingenuous to say actually if we're comparing ourselves to maybe some Arabic countries that have a quite traditional view of kind of gender equality and other areas of equality, it can be kind of a false narrative to hold ourselves in high regard. Ultimately, we really need to reflect on who we want to be as a nation. And I say the same for organisations. Like, who do you want to be as a company? What kind of legacy do you want? What kind of impact do you want to have on the community? You can't just look at your peers and say, actually, we're the best of a bad bunch, because ultimately you're not doing great things, but you're doing better than your peers. So that can lull you into a false sense of security. Ultimately, I want to live in a world where people are deeply passionate about this stuff, deeply passionate about the experiences that both their colleagues and also their clients have when engaging with their organisation. So coming back to your question around where we are as a nation, I would say not great. And I think recent unrest has really shed a light on that to say people are deeply unhappy. And I think some of the narratives that have come out of the press historically haven't done us any favours, because they seem to paint a negative picture of immigration. They seem to pin all of the UK's problems on kind of our dealing with immigration. I think that's a false narrative. I think some of the attention and time really needs to go into understanding what it is that we're doing in other areas. So how are we investing in local communities? How are we ensuring that people have kind of job stability and security? We've seen massive inflation over the years. How are we making sure that people's wages are rising in line with inflation? I think these are things that the government really needs to get a handle on. And obviously the change in regime hopefully should bring us a little bit closer to where we need to be, but understanding that no government is perfect.
It's economic pressures, I think, often fuel these sort of the unrest. And what I hear from the media is people from the far right complaining that they feel marginalised, and therefore taking it out in sort of racial abuse or targeting minority groups or immigrants. And yet we know that those social determinants of health and well-being are across the board. They're so important. And in medicine, when I was working in prison, it was very clear that there were disadvantaged groups of all ethnicities who actually were struggling for similar reasons, which were mainly economic.
Yes.
But then on top of that, you had this overlay of racial discrimination on some other groups who were disproportionately represented in prison. There's young black men, for example. Yeah. But then you've equally got these sort of social class 5 young white men who were also very likely to get criminalised. And
Yeah.
It's a perennial problem. I think I'm hoping that, as you say, that the new regime might balance that out. And way back when Tony Blair did his focus on the early years, that was the thing that health-wise made the biggest difference to the social determinants of health.
Yeah.
And that's all been undone in the last 10, 20 years of austerity.
Absolutely. And I think there has to be some kind of a long-term focus, because I think often politicians, and I think this is probably a factor of our political systems and the way they work, and, you know, we're big on incentives. So looking at the incentives, and when you look at political parties and the way they run, they're incentivized to capitalize on the short term. So knowing that you've got a 4-year term or an 8-year term or a 12-year term really encourages you to focus on what can we do in these 4 years to demonstrate that we're a good political party. Whereas we need to get into the habit of looking, what does this policy look like 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now? I think the more we can have that long-term view, the better chance we've got of resolving some of these deep-rooted issues. Because, you know, when we look at some of the towns and areas where we've had unrest, it is those towns that have traditionally had like mining communities, or traditionally had like quite a sector-specific or a profession-specific working environment. And actually, if you've destroyed a certain industry and not putting anything else to replace that, obviously people are going to find it harder to gain employment, going to find it harder to provide for their families. And ultimately, we're all humans and we want the best for our families, we want the best for our communities. And if you, as the government or politicians, aren't giving people that opportunity, it's natural that people feel aggrieved by that.
Yeah. Now, what do you think the recent unrest is a signal of in our current times?
It's a really good question. I think it's not a signal of one thing. I think there's many things. So I think we have to look at the media narratives that have come out around immigration. We have to look at the way that, and again, without getting kind of two-party political, the way that the Tory government has kind of stripped back on some of those core services that communities really rely on. We have to look at the rise in the prevalence of food banks. So cost of living crisis is a real issue that is really got a grip on the nation. I think just public sector provision generally has, for me, been at an all-time low. So, you know, you'll know more about this than I, but, you know, waiting times to see a doctor, just health in general, people are really struggling to maintain a good quality of life. And I think some of that is a hangover from the kind of COVID and pandemic.
Yeah.
But some of that is just about how we live. You know, if people can't afford to buy decent food or to access gyms and, you know, get out there and exercise, then naturally their health is going to suffer. And when your health suffers, everything else kind of crumbles. It's
one of those things that's the first to go, is the sort of the nice to have. We don't put health as a priority with our spending, do we? I guess talking about companies, I've seen companies, you know, kind of go green, you know, in recent times to support the environment, and then came the term greenwashing, where companies were sort of basically pretending to be green and not really being very green and signing up to something. Do you have the same thing happening in your area of diversity
absolutely.
And inclusion?
Absolutely. So many people have heard of the term greenwashing, which is companies positioning themselves as being greener than they are. In our world, we have diversity washing, which is similar concept, but for diversity and inclusion. So a lot of organizations will present themselves as being a lot more diverse than they are. So the typical example is that you look at somebody's website and you see diverse individuals interacting. They've got a good, you know, I'll say good, but it's not really good. So we are equal opportunities employers, and this is our diversity and inclusion statement. And then you will kind of find that typically organizations have strategically, you know, presented image on their website that gives an impression that they're diverse. So the same ethnically diverse individual appearing on multiple pages.
Okay.
You'll typically see, for Black History Month, you know, individuals rolled out to give talks about diversity and inclusion, or International Women's Day, International Women's Month, individuals being given a stage to share their stories, their journeys, and those individuals you never hear from again. And that can be deeply problematic. And I've spoken to a lot of people that have a significant amount of expertise in, you know, geoscience or, you know, whatever their specialism is. And it can be quite draining for them to only be given a microphone or only be given a spotlight when it's Black History Month or when it's International Women's Day. Typically, you'll find that a lot of organisations aren't as diverse as they claim they are. And what kind of furthers that dynamic is that there's a lot of companies out here that will give you a shiny badge. You know, you pay £10,000, £15,000. They run in and kind of walk you through all of these commitments that you say, yeah, we commit to, you know, hiring diversely, we commit to promotions. And then once you've paid your money, you never hear from them again. But you've got this shiny badge that you can put on your website to say, you know, we're a diverse and inclusive employer. And the truth of that is not there. And it's one of the reasons that we've shied away from accreditations and awards, but we focus on the data. So we encourage organizations to let your data tell the story. So if you can present data that shows actually we've got gender parity, so the amount of time it takes a female to become managing director is equal to the amount of time it takes a man to become managing director, that's your data, and that's the evidence that you're an organisation that takes this stuff seriously.
The objective evidence is really interesting, isn't it? And I kind of wonder whether that leads me to ask you about education, you know, our expectations, because what you've said so far is that we're setting the bar too low. So our expectations are set too low in this area. And for me, I guess that, you know, I always say culture eats strategy for breakfast, and you're working in the same way. What you're saying is you've got to change culture. It takes 3 to 5 years to do that. That, you know, we need a long-termism view in political changes. But I kind of think, well, if we're going long-term, we should start with kids in school.
Yep.
What do you feel kids in school should be being made aware of early on that would help them to then identify, you know, where the bar should be and keep pushing it, and both of all ethnicities?
That's a really good question. I think it's something that we often ponder on, and there's a number of dynamics that you can look at. We spoke earlier about the tendency for young people not to be exposed to that many careers and professions. I think that's a starting point. But within that, being exposed to different types of people doing those jobs. So really understanding that a mechanical engineer could be a man, could be a woman, could be someone from an ethnic minority community, could be a white British person. And I think the more we can open people's eyes up to understand that anybody can do anything, you can then give kind of young people a real chance to understand actually where does my passion lie, and let me not be constrained by actually only boys can play football. Actually, women can play football as well. And the more you reinforce that narrative, the more you tend to start to break down some of these stereotypical boxes that we feel that we have to fit into. There's a wider piece there as well in terms of the media representation of some of these things. So I think ingraining ourselves in media and, you know, newspapers, and just really being critical about what we see on the things that influence young people the most. So school is one aspect, but also we can't shy away from the fact that a lot of young people, a lot of kids are influenced by video games or movies or music. And I think when you can start to infiltrate those avenues, you can get more of a picture for what the art of the possible could be. Now,
you've started your own business. You came out of a very secure, well-paid, you know, position in the energy sector. How was it? Did you have to work long hours? I know you rated your health 6 out of 10 when we talked earlier. So, you know, what was the toll on your health in this?
It's a really good question. I think like starting a business isn't the hard part. I think growing, scaling, sustaining a business is like, that's when the real hard work starts. And I think I've got two young kids now, so 3.5 and 1.5. But before having kids, I've worked really, I guess, problematic and slightly toxic working culture. So I'd wake up around 4:35 in the morning.
Wow, that's pretty early.
Yeah, but I was also going to the gym at the time as well, so I felt it was really important to start my day with the gym.
Okay, so 5 a.m. club member, get up there, get the gym.
Yeah, absolutely. There's all kinds of literature around this as well, but getting to the gym really early, start my day by about 6:30 or 7, do kind of a couple of hours of work, and then start the stuff that people see, which is the meetings and engaging with team members, engaging with clients, and that would be like 9 to 5. And then 5 o'clock I'd have a bit of a break and then get back into it with kind of some of the admin and the work that needs to be done to sustain the business. So typically I was doing kind of 15, 16 hour days.
That's quite a long day. How long were you having to do that for to really, establish this?
Solidly for probably about 3 years, so 2.5, 3 years. And then, as I said, kind of kids came along, and what you realise when you have kids is that those hours, so prior to 9 o'clock, is all taken up by the kids. Sleepless nights, kind of long evenings. It wasn't possible for me to function in the same way. So I really probably took about 2 years to adjust to what does this look like from a working parent perspective. And also one of the things that from a diversity and inclusion perspective that we probably don't do enough to think about and to critique in terms of how do we as a society deal with working parents, how do we make sure that people have that level of comfort to understand, actually I want to be a really present father, I also want to be successful in the business that I'm creating, how do I navigate the two and what kind of adjustments do I need to make to accommodate for that?
And many of our listeners are, young entrepreneurs. They're starting their own business. They're also thinking those bigger questions in life. when do I have kids? And it strikes me that you've been through that squeeze, and you've come out the other side. What do you think the pressures are of running a business like this and the impact on people's mental health? Is that something that interests you?
Absolutely. I think it's I often say that the range of emotions that you go through as an entrepreneur on like an hour by hour, day by day basis is unparalleled to anything that you'd see being an employee. So when I was an employee, you'd win some contracts and you'd deliver some work, but the range of emotions was very narrow because it wasn't existential. Whereas as an entrepreneur, you win some clients, you'll lose some clients. Clients will, pay on time. It's probably the opposite. They tend to take a bit longer to pay than you expect. And there's all these kind of pressures, I guess, that as a business owner, you have to become accustomed to dealing with. But I think it is so intense that actually it's something that people need to go into with eyes open. One of the things I will say is that I think social media has glamorized this entrepreneur, this hustle culture that is like, that's the thing that people want to do, and actually the reality is probably so far removed from what people typically see from the Steve Jobs and the Jeff Bezoses and all of these. Like, those are the success stories, but for every success story, I'm sure there's like thousands of stories that haven't ended in billionaire status and private jets and building rockets to the moon.
It's the hard graft rather than the show reel that actually is the reality of entrepreneurship, isn't it? Looking backwards for you, what do you think fell by the wayside of the things that you felt with the things you loved to do, that when you had kids and you had the business, you had to compromise on, and do you think that that was the right decision if some of those things were lost?
Oh, it's a good question. I think it's always difficult to know what the right decision is in real terms. None of us really know, because I think all of the decisions that I've made have led me to this point, and I'm grateful for kind of where I am. But just to give an example, obviously I spoke about when I was doing 15, 16 hour days that I'd start the day with the gym. That's something that just went out the window. I just had no time for it with young kids. And then there's also a thing about supporting my wife as well. So me going to the gym would have been quite a selfish move to make while she was breastfeeding or changing nappies, etc. So I wanted to be present, and that's one of the things that I had to do. I used to do football every Friday as well, so that was something that for me marked the end of my week. With business, you can be so focused on the challenges that you're probably not doing yourself many favours by just continuing to focus on what seems like a challenge.
Matt, you've hit the nail on the head there, but we've run out of time. Thanks so much for coming today. It's been fantastic speaking to you.
Thank you, you too.
So I do hope you enjoyed today's episode of Health versus Wealth with Dr. Ben, and I hope it may help you improve your life and health. You can also take one easy step by achieving that right now by subscribing free on your usual podcast platform. And if you'd like to be a guest on the show, you can email me on podcast@drfinlays.co.uk. I hope you'll join me again, but for now it's goodbye from me, Dr. Ben.